Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this video on Top 10 Middle Game Ideas number 4, the Minority Attack. This is the first in a series of videos I'm going to do on the Minority Attack. So I'm going to be introducing the ideas and I have a couple example games to go over as well. So let's put on a starting position for the Minority Attack here. This is a line in the Queen's Gambit declined known as the exchange variation. So here we go, c4, e6. So standard Queen's Gambit declined, knight c3 and knight f6, the most common moves. And then c takes d5, that's the exchange variation. And black normally takes back with the pawn, keep a pawn in the center. Now bishop g5 pinning the knight, c6 defending the center, and e3 developing, opening up a line for the light squared bishop, securing the center, and it's good to do now that this bishop is outside the pawn chain. So this is the position from which we can start a minority attack. And so what is the minority attack, or what does the minority refer to? It refers to these pawns here. The 3 pawns on the queen side of whites are a minority compared to the 4 pawns that black has on the queen side. And white is going to come up with a very surprising plan, at least at first it might be surprising, of just pushing those pawns forward and attacking the majority. So this kind of flies in the face of conventional chess wisdom, and it was a bit of a surprise when it first became popular in the first half of the 20th century. The reason is that sort of classical chess theory is that you should play where you have an advantage. And black, having an advantage of pawns on one side of the board, is normally encouraged to push those pawns forward. And it makes a lot of sense in general. That is true. The majority attack, if you want to call it that, is probably the more normal way to play in many situations where you can play that way. You push those pawns forward to gain space, to give your pieces squares and outposts, and to potentially gain a passed pawn for the endgame. So there's a lot of things that can be done with the majority of pawns if you're able to mobilize it and get it going. In this case, though, because of this particular pawn structure, it's a little bit difficult for black to push those pawns forward. So it seems like he can't easily get his majority rolling. The first point is that this d-pawn is actually a key part of that minority attack. You might think the minority is just these 2 pawns here, but this pawn on d4 is playing a key role in guarding the c5 square. And if black pushes that pawn, white's going to take it, leaving this isolated d-pawn here. So I think that wouldn't work at all right now because of the pin. At times it might be possible to push the c-pawn forward, but then white will have play against the black's d-pawn. So you might say this d-pawn is holding back or discouraging the advance of the c-pawn, and so it kind of paralyzes these pawns, and white is free to push his pawns forward. And eventually he'll get to the point where these pawns make contact, and the exchanges, white will try and arrange the exchanges so that weaknesses are left behind. It has to be done a little bit carefully. For example, if this is played when black can trade off a pawn by taking on b5, may leave him with this one isolated pawn, but maybe 2 pawns against one. Might be okay. So we'll see more often white will try and arrange it where the b pawn takes the c pawn. This pawn takes back. Black's b pawn takes back on c6. And then this pawn on c6 will be a backwards pawn on a half-open file. And so white can pile up on that pawn. That'll become a weakness in black's camp, and white can try and get some mileage out of it. And there's other ways. There's other exchanges. We'll have examples of that. But that's the general idea of the minority attack. So before I get to the game, I wanted to say a few words about this particular pawn structure. There are other structures in which a minority attack can be played, but this is the most common one, and this is called the Carlsbad structure. And now notice, well, first of all, let's be pedantic for a minute. I spelled Carlsbad with a C. You'll also see that it is spelled with a K, particularly in German sources. So if you're looking up games in ChessBase and you want to find the Carlsbad tournament, you have to look up Carlsbad with a K. But if you go on Wikipedia to find out about the Carlsbad tournament, you have to look up Carlsbad with a C to find it there. I think in English it's most commonly spelled with a C, but you also see it spelled with a K in English language sources as well. Anyway, the city of Carlsbad is actually in Czechoslovakia and or the Czech Republic now, and they have their own name for it too. But we're going to continue to call it Carlsbad. This pawn structure here was named after a tournament that was held in Carlsbad in 1929. And that was the fourth of four major tournaments that were held there. I actually wasn't sure which tournament it got its name from, so I did a search on ChessBase of how many times this kind of position occurred. And it wasn't this exact position, but it was a position with this pawn structure. 3 pawns here on a diagonal from b7 to d5, the e file being open, and then these 3 pawns from f2 to d4 with the c file being open. That particular structure is known as the Carlsbad structure, and that's what I searched for on ChessBase, on their big database in the Carlsbad tournaments, and I found out that this position occurred once in 1907. Didn't occur at all in the second tournament in 1911. It occurred 4 times in the tournament in 1923, and it occurred 10 times in the tournament in 1929. And it did really well. It kind of arrived on the scene with a bang, I guess, so it got named after that Carlsbad 1929 tournament. Of all 15 games, 8 of them were won by white, in all 15 games where this structure occurred. There were 5 draws, and there were only 2 wins by black. So that's a very strong bias in white's favor, much more than you get from a typical opening. So it had a reputation of being a pretty strong way to play. I think the modern point of view is that that black is okay in this position because black has, in compensation, activity. So, for example, this bishop, the light-squared bishop, is normally blocked in behind the pawn chain in a typical, more closed Queen's Gambit declined type of position, whereas the exchange variation has given black a chance to open up a diagonal. So black gets active piece play, and white has this long-term minority attack plan. And as long as black has figures out, either does well in the middle game or figures out how to deal with the minority attack, he should be okay. But I think still this is interesting to learn today, and something that's worth trying out in your own games, because one advantage is that it's fairly easy for white to play. So even if it's technically okay for black, if you look at this position of the chess engine, it gives no more than a typical opening advantage. So nothing great going on here. But white's play is a little bit easier. Black is forced to be active with his pieces and try and come up with some answer for this very simple plan that white has of pushing those pawns forward. Okay, so that sets the scene. Let's take a look at the first game. This first game I wanted to show you, I think, demonstrates the essence of the minority attack in kind of a stripped-down form. So I think it's pretty interesting. This game was played in 1932 between Salo Floor and Max Euwe, and it was part of a 16-game match between the two players. Now, at the time in 1932, Alexander Alekhine was world champion, and Floor and Euwe were 2 of the contenders. So they were sort of jockeying for position to be the one to challenge the world champion. And in fact, Euwe later, a few years later, I think 35, 36, somewhere around there, managed to play Alekhine in the world championship match and defeat him. So he became the world champion. So we have 2 of the top players of the 30s facing off here. The 16-game match, by the way, ended in a draw with 8 points to each side. In this particular game, Floor has the white pieces, and let's see, I'm going to go quickly through some parts of it. So let's just get to kind of the starting position. We have a Slav defense rather than the regular Queen's Gambit declined. But after this trade, we get the Carlsbad structure again. And this position is in the database slightly different than the last position. It has a win rate of about 60%. So good position for white, but not overwhelming. And it looks like black should really be fine here. And black does the right things. Black tries to play actively on the king side, although actually it's white here that makes the first active move. Floor at this time, he became later known as a very positional player. In this game, definitely has those elements, but at the time he was actually considered a very sharp tactical player. So he's playing actively here with knight e5. The most common move so far up to this point, we've actually been following a main line, and the main line continues with h3. So, but he didn't play that way. He played with knight to e5, and just trying to be a little more active with his pieces. So Irva plays the move knight to g4. So he wants to be active with his pieces as well. But this just leads to some trades. Let's see, the dark squared bishops come off, and then the knight comes off. But the light squared bishop gets activated on this good diagonal. And now Floor plays the move rook f to e1. We're already in kind of a rare section of the database. This position hasn't been seen too many times, but the other times the most common move was rook a to e1. And this may relate to another plan that white has in this Carlsbad structure, which is, you can actually go back to a majority attack in cases like this, push these pawns forward and just try and establish a majority of pawns in the center. That might be a valid way to play in this case. But anyway, Floor played with the move rook f to e1, keeping a rook on the queen side. Let's see, rook a to d8 was played here. And let's go on a few more moves. Let's have the knight maneuvers, and notice that black has gotten his rook up and over, and so black is following with this plan that I talked about of going for active piece plays, trying to drum up some kind of king side attack. But Floor manages to neutralize it with this bishop to f5 move. So after this trade and h3, the queen has to go back, and there is not a whole lot going on. So it seems like there was that kind of initial thrust from black here, a flurry of activity, but then black was beaten back, and now Floor decides that he can switch his attention to the queen side and plays b4, just the start of the traditional minority attack here. So the knight starts maneuvering. Irva brings his knight over to the queen side to defend. Oh, he doesn't play a1. I'm sorry, he played rook to b1 first. The knight came over here, and now he played a4. And black played a6. And now the attack is actually stalled. These two pawns are kind of stuck. If you go and push the a pawn forward, you'll fix this structure, but you don't have a great way to attack it. What you really want to do is push the b pawn forward, but in this case, that would just lose a pawn. So we get into another long phase of maneuvering. So let's just flash fast forward through this and get... notice, I guess I do want to point out this c5 square is often a good outpost for white's pieces in this Carlsbad structure, and so that's something else to keep an eye on. Let's continue. So more maneuvering. The knight can drop back to d3. It does it there, and can run around. And now at this point, Irva plays the move knight to e6. Maybe he was just kind of tired of waiting around. The chess engine gives rook to f8 as the best move. But with this move, knight to e6, and it gives a slight edge to white, but maybe black should still be able to hold that. With knight to e6, it seems like this is big trouble for black. So this is something that's approaching the range of indefensible. It's maybe a strategic win for white at this point, because with the with the minor pieces gone, the minority attack is really, it can really pick up steam now. And Fleur pushes on immediately with b5. So I guess that's one point to keep in mind, is that if you can get rid of all the minor pieces, which is certainly not always as easy as it was in this game, that can lead to a very effective minority attack here. Anyway, the pawn comes forward, and what is black going to do about it? He decided to take. If he doesn't take, white's going to take, and there will be some weaknesses there in any case. So it's black's turn. Black takes, white takes, black takes, and white takes. And now this is not only has one weakness been created, but two weaknesses have been created. Keep an eye on the pawn on d5 as well as the pawn on the b file there. Erva pushes the b pawn forward, so he's just going to try and hold this position, but it's kind of an example of the principle of two weaknesses. There's two weaknesses, and Fleur is just going to arrange his pieces to train them on both of those weaknesses. So he plays queen to b3 here, looking at the d pawn as well as piling up on the b pawn. The queen gets out of that potentially uncomfortable pin, comes over here to d6 to defend. This rook goes to b1, and that's it. A pawn is going to fall. This pawn is attacked twice now and defended twice, but this pawn is attacked 3 times, and if the rook comes over to defend it, then this pawn is left underdefended. So Erva played rook to d7, holding on to the d pawn, which is probably the correct decision, but now the straight occurs. Rook takes, queen takes, rook takes, and rook takes b6. So we're just into a king and pawn endgame where we have 5 pawns against 4, which is probably just a technical win. Let's see, the game continued. King f7, king to h2, king to e7, king to g3. Black can't afford to trade rooks. He's got to try and keep the rook on and hopefully get it active. So the rook comes over here to a7. King comes forward. Let's see, g6 to keep the king out from coming any further into the position. G4. Rook a2, hitting the f-pawn. The king drops. Oh, before moving the king, cancel that. Before moving the king, Fleur throws in this move, rook a7 check. The king goes to e6, and then this king drops back to g3. And Erva resigned at this point. I guess he just felt he couldn't hold it and maybe wanted to save his strength for the next game. It would have been interesting to see the rest of the game played out and watch Fleur's technique as he converted this. But as I said before, 5 pawns against 4, unless there's special factors. This should be a win for white. Just too many pawns here. Okay, that's the first game. Let's take a look at the next one that I wanted to show you. The next game I wanted to show you was played in 1923 at the Carlsbad tournament. With the white pieces we have Ernst Grünfeld, and with the black pieces we have Karel Trebal. So Grünfeld starts off with d4, and we get a queen's gambit declined here, d5, c4, e6. So standard position, knight c3. And Trebal goes for the triangle setup. So it's a semi-Slav. And now he plays the move g6. So g6 is a pretty rare move. In fact, we're out of the opening book already. Knight f6 is pretty normal. I don't think this is a particularly good way to play. I think also Grünfeld in this game had opportunities to play better. So Grünfeld's play, neither Grünfeld's play nor Karel Trebal's play are examples of the best play in all cases. But it is a good example of the minority attack and shows some different features of it. So we'll look at it from that point of view. Okay, so g6. Let's see. Grünfeld continues with knight f3. We get some normal development, bishop g7, bishop d3, and now f5. So continuing this plan, I guess, Treball has of putting all his pawns on light squares and setting up something that looks a lot like a stonewall defense. So white castles here, and knight d7, b3, just holding up the queen side there. And now at this point, after knight h6, he decides to trade. So at this point, after that exchange, c takes d5, e takes d5, we have the classic Carlsbad structure. We have these three pawns here on light squares, and these three pawns on the dark squares. We have the open c file for white and the open e file for black. This is a little worse than the normal Carlsbad structure, though, because of this this f pawn. At the moment, this f pawn is blocking the light squared bishop, and so it's turned that into a very bad piece. I think the idea black has here is if he can castle, he can turn this into more of an aggressive position by pushing the f pawn forward and trying to weaken white over here on the king side. But that just does not work out very well in this game. And it starts with this move, bishop to a3. I think this is a good move, just preventing black from castling so he can't get his rook on the f file. So Treball brings his queen out to try and harass the bishop, but Grinfeld just defends it there, keeps the bishop in place. And, well, knight f7, this knight's maneuvering around, trying to find a more useful position. And now he goes with b4. And we can see the beginnings of a minority attack. He's starting to push those queenside pawns forward. In fact, after queen d8, he pushes it all the way to b5. So that's one interesting thing about this game, is that white managed to get pawn to b5 in without even the help of the a pawn. And it works in this case because c takes b5 is just a terrible move here. After bishop takes, this knight is pinned, the king can't castle, and there's no way to defend the d pawn. That pawn is just falling. And so without a center, without a d pawn in the center, and with his king still in the middle of the board and unable to castle, that game is going to be over really quickly. So after b5, well, Carroll's a strong enough player, he's not going to fall for that. Plays queen a5, just bringing his queen back over here to the queen side. So rook to b1, supporting the b pawn, and bishop to f8. So I'm sure he was sad to do this because he's put all his pawns on light squares and now he's getting rid of his dark squared bishop, which is the opposite of what you want to do. But he probably felt the need to get rid of this pressure. So let's see, white just defended the bishop, and Treball traded that bishop off. So after bishop takes, rook takes, queen went forward to b4. But at this point, Grinfeld decided to go ahead and take on c6. So that move had been in the air for a while now, and at this point he decided to go ahead and create that weakness. So now he takes at a time when the only piece that can take back is a pawn. So now there is this weak pawn on c6 that he can focus his attention on, and that will give Grinfeld a strategy for the rest of the game, basically. So let's see, rook to b3. Chasing the queen, getting the rook on an open file. The queen drops back to d6, defending the c pawn. Knight to a4. This keeps the c pawn backwards. You know, if he pushes it forward, white can just take it. So it just prevents that. Even if he does push it forward, it does create an isolated d pawn. So it's kind of inhibited from coming forward. But this actually prevents it, and it also sets up ideas of using this c5 square as an outpost or a way station for white's pieces, and we'll see that in the game. Let's see. Anyway, black finally got castled, so that was he had to pay a big price for that. He had to give up his dark squared bishop, but he did get his king to safety. And now rook to c3, increasing the pressure on the c pawn. Knight to d8, so the knight is perhaps coming over here to the queen side to help defend things. Knight to c5. So the first use of c5 as an outpost, it gets traded off immediately, but well, a piece takes back. Now it's the second use of the c5 square as an outpost. Let's see, rook to f7, giving black the possibility of doubling rooks on the B file maybe. Queen to C2. Let's go forward here. Well, rook to E7. He decides to put that on the E file here. And knight to E5. So increasing the pressure on the C pawn. He's got 3 pieces on it. Bishop to D7. And now rook to C1. And so this is pretty much maximized the pressure on that pawn. He's got 4 pieces on it. Let's see. Black drops back the bishop. He doesn't want black to trade off that bishop and take the pawn. He needs all 4 of those pieces to defend it. But anyway, he's holding on for the moment. And, you know, now that I look at this, I'm wondering if black could really just take that pawn. Knight takes, rook takes, bishop takes. It loses the exchange. Okay, so he's only got 3 pieces defending it, but it's sufficient to hold on to the pawn for the moment. Okay, so white continues with G3. So what's interesting about this phase is that white is sort of maxed out. He's created the maximum amount of pressure he could on this C pawn, and now he's just going to hold it there and kind of maneuver his pieces around and look for other targets and try to find ways to make trouble. And this is very typical of how you might take advantage of some kind of a positional edge. You have a positional edge, and you need to just kind of maneuver your pieces around and find a way to take advantage of it. And he starts off with his G3 move just to give his king a square to escape to in case there's checks along the back rank. It also maybe is stopping black's idea of pushing the f-pawn forward. So let's go forward through the maneuvering. Just see pieces being shuffled about here and there, looking at different targets. Notice that the a-pawn is also a target, so there's actually 2 weaknesses over here, the a-pawn and the c-pawn. And black is shifting his attention between these 2 targets, and eventually black decides to trade off that rook. But still, okay, and now we see the queen coming to c5, so that's the 3rd piece that has used c5 as an outpost. And notice the knight down here defending the pawn is not in a position to chase pieces off of that outpost. So anyway, let's continue. Bishop to e8. Knight is doing some more maneuvering. The queen drops back, and after a while we'll see the knight take the outpost. There. So that's the 4th piece that's gone into that outpost in the course of the maneuvering. And we're just going to continue on with some more maneuvering here. And then finally we get this move. So at some point, black has decided he couldn't accomplish anything more pushing his pieces around over here, and he invades. And maybe he just saw this opportunity to get a piece on the back rank. So this goes towards an endgame here, putting the queen there. Let's see. Black doesn't trade immediately, but plays instead bishop back to e8, blocking the queen's view of the rest of the back rank here. So Grunfeld goes ahead and trades, takes the queen off, but he gets his rook to the back rank, so he manages to invade into white's camp with his pieces. Let's see, the king goes to e7, and f3 is played here. So with this knight here, and notice that that trade that black made of his dark squared bishop, which he needed to do to free up his to allow him to castle, means that it's very difficult for him to challenge this knight. This knight is sitting here. The only piece that could challenge it is the other knight, and doesn't have easy access to these squares. I guess he could consider bringing the knight to this square, so maybe not entirely true. But anyway, this knight survives on the outpost, and well, f3 keeps black's knight from coming here. So now this knight is sort of can't be challenged, and starting to dominate the chessboard in a way from this position on c5. So let's continue. And he pushes pawns forward on both sides of the board. He lifted the a-pawn, and now he's going to push pawns over here on the queen side as well. And after this exchange, he's created another weakness in that this h-pawn over on the right side of the board. This is another weakness that black can go after. Let's see, h6 is pushed, and now e4, also just threatening to push through in the center and chase the knight back. So black is getting a little bit desperate here. He tries the move knight to c4, and after this trade, white is just going to kind of mop up the pieces here. But there's some interesting tactics coming up. So the king comes over to stop that pawn from queening, and black pushes the h-pawn. And now white, Grunfeld here just pushed a6, but there was actually an interesting line here. He could have taken the pawn here, and maybe he was afraid of this. Bishop takes, and it looks like that bishop is going to come in and wipe out these weak pawns over here. But there's this neat tactic. That's why I wanted to show this to you. The rook comes over here, hits the bishop, and, well, the bishop needs to move. Say the bishop takes the pawn, then this check here, rook h7 check, wins the rook. If you want to think about this for a while, see if you can figure out why that rook is lost. It's an interesting tactical sequence there. So yeah, pause the video if you want time to think about it. I'm going to give the answer away now. So there's only two squares the king can go to protect the rook. If the king goes back to d8, then knight to e6 check is a fork that picks up the rook. And if the king goes the other way, the king goes up to d6, then this pawn can come forward. The e pawn can come forward with check. The knight is guarding these squares, and well, the king can come forward again, but once again he's losing the rook. So rook h7 check wins the rook. So in fact, in this position, probably the simplest way for white to win is to take advantage of that tactic. But instead, he pushed the pawn to a6. And that also has an interesting point to it. So, so black, though, starts to get some play, counterplay on the other side with h4. Rook to b8. Bishop to f7 was played here. Let's see. One more line. Black could have done a little better than bishop f7. Although I think this is still winning for white. This is just an interesting try here. You could push on with h3. Let's see. We get king takes, grabbing the c-pawn before it becomes a menace. h2. Rook to b1, getting the rook back just in time to stop the pawn. King comes forward to f6. Rook to h7. The rook has to come over. And king to d3. This is the position I wanted to get to and show you. It's one of those things that's kind of lurking behind the scenes in this game. And there's no way that black can stop white's king from just marching over here and taking this pawn. And what's interesting is the way that this knight on a dark square here completely dominates this bishop on a light square. And, well, this was a game that started off with black placing all of his pawns on light squares. He's pushed them forward, which has opened up some more lines, but look at how the knight is defending this pawn. So the bishop, if you look at all the squares it can go to, it's kind of locked in this cage that it can never escape. It is completely trapped in its own camp and can never break out of there. So anyway, it's a easy win for white from that point, but well, anyway, it was another way that black could have tried to proceed there, pushing that h-pawn forward. Anyway, he went with bishop to f7. So the king takes this pawn. Bishop comes out to c4. The bishop gets active, at least on this line. King to c3, hitting the bishop. The bishop drops down to f1. Maybe it'll attack this pawn from the other side. And then the final move of the game is rook to b7, and black resigned. So you might think black has just given up because of it's run out of ideas, but actually there's no way to save this rook here. The same tactics are coming into play. So first of all, if rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, and there's no way to stop the pawn from becoming a queen. So point number one, the rook can't take the rook. Point number two, the rook can't escape. It's pinned, so it can't go back to the back rank. and it can't go to to e7 there, or d7. It just gets taken by the knight or the rook. So the rook can't move, can't take it, can't run away, and it's hanging. It needs to be defended. And if the king defends it, we have the same tactic that we saw with the rook on the other side. If the king defends from this square, then we have knight to e6 check. And if the king defends from this square, then we have e5 check. And in any case, that rook is lost. So black is going down a whole rook at this point, and he resigned. Okay, that's it for this video. I'm going to be back with some more examples of the minority attack, and I'm not sure how many videos this will be. Eventually, I will also show some successful defenses against the minority attack. But hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will see you again soon. Bye.